more than, let me see, maybe 12, 13 years ago, I went to Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne.
Ah, okay. Were you like teaching here or
For
lecturing?
work, actually. That was back when I was the program director at the Qasid Arabic Institute.
Ah,
So
okay.
I went to the University of Melbourne.
Oh, okay, mashallah. Yeah, I'm actually originally from Sydney. I only moved to Melbourne like over a year ago, so it's interesting to bring up the coffee culture. It's definitely a hit here in Melbourne. What do you like
Yeah.
better, Sydney or Melbourne?
What's that?
What did you like better, Sydney or Melbourne?
Oh, come on. There's no contest. Of course, Melbourne.
Oh, really?
Yeah, of
Interesting. Yeah,
course.
look at that.
I don't like the urban lifestyle too much. So I liked Melbourne was more laid back, wider streets. Sydney was like rush in some places. And okay, Auburn has like the Muslim place, Bankstown, a lot of Muslims too.
Oh, mashallah, you
So
actually know the streets. That's
yeah,
that's amazing.
Lakemba. I know Lakemba Mosque, Gallipoli Mosque. I've heard those mosques. Dar Aisha. So like the religious places, that's great. It's Sydney is great for that. It has a better scene than Melbourne.
SubhanAllah. You're like everything you said, Sheikh, like I literally endorse. Because a lot of my friends, right, like they think I'm a trader, like, because I've lived Sydney my whole life. Alhamdulillah, community there, a lot of network there and all that.
Yeah,
So I moved to
yeah.
Melbourne a bit over a year. And so my Sydney friends always ask me like, hey, like, what do you think is better? When I say like literally for me, someone like, I think, not gonna lie, like tying into the topic today with spirituality and tasawwuf, all that sort of stuff. I honestly feel Melbourne, alhamdulillah, like has actually cleared my mind up. I feel like a lot more relaxed mentally because of just the rush. Like you don't realize, like I guess my whole life I've been living in Sydney. It's like such busy, areas and streets and people. You feel like you have to keep up, right? So Melbourne's like really put me in a different element where I feel a lot more relaxed, easygoing, and can be in tune with myself. So yeah, so I appreciate what you said because I endorse 100% what definitely
Good,
come
good.
to
One of
Melbourne.
you guys, if I ever come to Melbourne or like to Australia again, I have few people told me to come down, but nothing like enough to make like a tour. To go all the way there, you need to make a big kind of thing. So it'd be nice to meet you one day. And Nadeem, you're in the UK, so it's closer to me, much closer to me.
You're in the West Indies, if I'm not mistaken,
No,
right?
I'm in Canada. I'm in
No.
Toronto.
Oh, mashallah. Okay, in Toronto.
I hope my bio. I hope you guys have my recent bio because if you think I'm in the West Indies, I was there 3 years ago.
Okay. I think yes. I think maybe your bio on I think your Seeker's Guidance might be outdated then.
Oh, very outdated. So I have not worked with them in years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm an independent, in the independent scholar activity, and I'm an imam part time. I'm also a counselor for Canadian Muslim Counselling. Those are the things that I'm up to now.
Alhamdulillah.
Mashallah.
In terms of like, we know also like when you Google yourself, the first thing that's so even on your Instagram profile, it talks about your conversion from Hinduism to Islam. So since we're on the topic of spirituality, I'm just curious because obviously, mashallah, like you've studied overseas and been acquainted with yourself, I'm sure, with many great scholars. And there is along that journey of Deen and Islam, everyone naturally becomes a bit more acquainted with the spiritual side of things. It's not necessarily all just rules and regulations and following them, right? So I always have that discussion with my friends. Like, I've seen a lot more people that in the way that they practice Islam, it's like a to-do list, right? So obviously Islam's more than that, right? So I'm just curious, like from your background, like when you were before you converted. What would you differentiate as the spirituality in Hinduism from Islam? So would you say all religious spirituality are very similar and it's just about following the truth? And in our case, like Islam's the truth in the rational, logical sense side of things, but also is it a different kind of spirituality? I don't know. I'm just curious.
That's a good question. That's a very good question. Spirituality is experiential. Okay. There are things that you can write about it, you can talk about it, but in the end, the whole point is that it's the spirit. It's what's inside that's experiencing the truths that are contained within those teachings. So different streams of spirituality exist within Islam, and anything that you have in Islam can become spiritual. So you can make it cut and dry, you can make it very concrete, or you can find even like there's some people, their spirituality is in charity. There's some people whose spirituality is in literally fighting to defend deen. Like that's where they find their spiritual awakening. There are some people who their spirituality is reciting Quran. Others, their spirituality is in healing, in treating the sick. So for some people it's prayer. For some people it's dhikr. That's the most kind of stereotypical way. But the ways of remembering Allah are many. Anything you do, you can remember Allah. I mean, in traditional Islamic societies, the baker, if he intended to bake bread to feed Allah's creation, he was performing a spiritual act. There were, in Turkey and in the heartlands of Islam, there were entire, orders and groups of people who did crafts, and just like a master, kind of like a tailor or like someone weaving a carpet, and everybody around, all the students are just weaving a carpet, and they're remembering Allah. That was their form of spirituality. That is the door through which you enter into the heart, right? Into the world of the heart. Once you go inside that world, then it's really a journey inwardly to Allah, and then within the knowledge of getting to know Allah. So that's what they call, Islamic spirituality. With Hinduism, and I have to be fair that I've only spent the first 18 years of my life as a Hindu, and the next 23 years of my life so far, alhamdulillah, as a Muslim. So I know a lot more about the Muslim side. I experienced Hinduism as a child and as a teenager. But I would say that Hinduism, without selling it short as well, because, I like to be fair, it has the side of the polytheism and the idolatry that people see, but there is a very deep spiritual tradition. But the key is this. It's what would spirituality be if you had thousands of years to think about it and meditate about it, but you didn't have guidance and revelation from Allah? And this is the difference between the two paths. That's why people who don't have religion, they go into like yoga, they go into meditation, they go into even Buddhism, this type of thing. But Hindu spirituality, they do find that there is some peace in it. There is the meditation, the yoga, all these types of things has deep teachings. But the whole thing is, how far can you get if you don't have revelation? Meaning, if the Lord of the worlds has not actually sent a message to you, how will you reach him? So it's an attempt to reach him. It's the next best thing short of revelation. And even if you do, because there are two things that come up when it comes to spirituality. Number one is that Allah is an objective reality. Okay, God is an objective reality. He's not a figment of the Muslim imagination. Like we have Allah and they have something else and they have something else. No, Allah is the one Lord of the entire universe, right? And so therefore, anybody can actually, know that Allah is one. Anybody can actually realize that Allah is one. How they connect to him, that's now their attempt. So, but one thing that Allah has made like a kind of a sunnah of Allah in the world is that anybody who fights their nafs, their desires, their ego, anyone who fights their nafs will eventually lower their ego and see some type of spiritual I don't want to say enlightenment, that's a very broad term, but they will have some type of spiritual upliftment. Okay? That, however, gets confused in the different religious groups as being true or untruth. And there's two different things. You can feel very spiritually uplifted. It's because you lowered your ego or because you're trying to seek God, right? The creator. But you have that light, you feel that light, but you don't have guidance, you don't have huda. So this is actually a very interesting dichotomy that when I learned about it, because I couldn't understand something, after studying abroad we were abroad for about 16 years, alhamdulillah. And at the same time, like you're seeing other mystics or other devotees of different religions. How are they like getting wisdom? How are they feeling like they have a religious experience when we know Islam is the true authentic religious experience? Like there's no way but to Allah but through Islam. So how is it that these people feel that way? This is the explanation, that they've just worked on themselves. So there is a reward that Allah gives. Just like how if you work hard in dunya, you'll make money, right? If you're a very nice person, people will like you. If you exercise, you'll get strong. Same thing with your nafs. If you work on your ego, it will clear up some of the veils between you and reality and truth. So you'll get some wisdom and truth on your tongue. But the heart, the feeling in the heart that you get, what they call enlightenment, what they call an opening, an awakening, it's not guided by revelation. And so what ends up happening is they spend two things. Either number one, they are so bewildered by it and they don't know how to interpret it. So they look around for whatever they know in their culture. So if all you know in your culture is Chinese wisdom, or Egyptology or Native American spirituality, they try to interpret that experience of what they think is like connecting with God into the vernacular of their culture. So it comes out sounding more Hindu, comes out sounding more Buddhist, comes out sounding more, Native American or Christian. But they're just trying to use terms that are already limited and flawed. So they're not getting closer to truth. They're just trying to interpret a feeling. Second thing is that they spend the rest of their life, they have one experience that Allah allowed them to have, maybe, and they spend the rest of their life trying to figure out what it is, and they just make it up. So there's some truth and wisdom, but it's just made up. It's just added on to a bunch of stuff. The difference with Islam was that it wasn't just airy-fairy, feel good. You go to that experience, but you live in it. You stay in it, day in, day out. You have a system that guides you on why you're having that experience. What action is that experience supposed to lead you to? Philosophical questions are no longer open. They're actually, you know exactly what the reality is and what the eternal truths are. That's a long way of saying that is how I differentiate between non-Muslim spirituality and Islamic spirituality. Sorry for the long spiel.
No, it was brilliant, mashallah. I think I want to pick up on something you said actually, which I found really interesting about kind of Hindus, Buddhists, whoever it may be, may find some sort of spiritual enlightenment or spiritual, whatever you want to term it, from practices like yoga, etc. It's reminded me of something really interesting that Ibn al-Qayyim says about the levels of prayer, when he says, the fifth level of prayer is to present your heart to Allah, and the way you achieve that is by separating yourself from the dunya. So it sounds like there's an attempt there from the Hindu mystics or Buddhist mystics, whatever, to separate themselves from the dunya through practices like yoga or meditation, whatever it may be. But the part that they're missing is presenting the heart to Allah Azza wa Jalla, right?
Right, because remember, they're still guessing at what is out there. They're still guessing at who the divine being is. So they're going to interpret it according to their own. They just know that it's a light that's come to them, or a realization, and they've gotten a lot of worldly wisdom. And so that's the difference, where the Muslim, even the common Muslim, starts at the level where they end, which is the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even a common Muslim may know more than them about the eternal truths, but they might not be as refined in terms of the wisdom that the other person has gained just by merely working on themselves for a long time. The two have to be together if you want to reach true enlightenment, as they call it.
Thank you so much for bringing this up in the way I articulate, because I relate, like, for me, as a Muslim, especially I know with Nadeem, we've had these conversations where we don't necessarily, like, unfortunately, I think a lot of, like, many Muslims look at other religions from a very Orientalist lens, like, look at Hindus doing these kind of actions, it looks bad or ridiculous, or Buddhism, whatever it is, right? But unfortunately, like, the problem is, like, non-Muslims look at Muslims doing certain actions and laugh at us. So I don't see the point of taking that exact same lens and judging other religions accordingly. So, like, that's the first point. The second point is, like, we mentioned in brief about yoga and how Hindus incorporate that. Like, there's so much deep wisdom and tradition. Like, even with some of their stories with their gods, can extract wisdoms and moral teachings that they implement in regards to detaching themselves from the worldly existence. And in that sense, it does correlate Islamic in some sense, where we have that aspect of detaching from the dunya, right? So that's why they will get a bit of enlightenment, because they are following, like, no, they're not following the Sharia in the exact way, but they're following that sort of means or similar means that a Muslim might, right? So then they have those experiences as well. So, like, in my personal experience, like, my line manager at work, he's Indian, Hindu, and he's very, like, you can tell he's very switched on about spirituality. So me and him, we always have, like, discussions about spirituality. He does like I mean, it's impressive. Like, literally early in the morning, I know that he does meditation, and I know in his work time, in lunchtime, he doesn't eat anything up until basically lunchtime, and then there's a period where I think 20 minutes he meditates. Wow. And then he has food after. And so me and him, we know, like, we're sort of on our own faith and following that, but we actually, like, very similar. And, like, when I talk to him, it doesn't really feel like he doesn't get it. You know what I mean? Because it's like the trajectories of spirituality are very similar in that regard. So I think it's like important to also have that understanding. But in saying that, there is a end point in the sense that that connection with Allah. It's like my friend actually. It's funny. Maybe I can do an episode in one time. But like he's Muslim and stuff. But he was curious and did this Buddhist retreat, and so he was able to understand what the Buddhist system is and the processes. And yeah, he said like there was good stuff and something to pick from, but at the end of it was a bit shallow. Not a bit, like the way that, like for us theologically speaking, right? Like the essence of Islam, like the afterlife, being judged on our present actions, all that connection, and with our spirituality being present, like all of this, like theology and spirituality is interlinked, right? And then that is linked to like our relationship with the people around us, fostering that one ummah perspective, regardless of nationality or race. So there's that interconnectedness in Islam that I don't think is comparable through other religions as well, especially when it's tied to your spirituality and tied to your history, and then tied to different people, different nations as well. So definitely, like how like it's such a guidance that like we have the Sharia that Allah has given us. I mean, unfortunately, many Muslims like take it for granted, right? Because they're just born into Islam. But it's important that we reconnect. I don't really have a question. I just like sharing my thoughts.
I think I agree with you completely. That how you said about your line manager at work. I think the people of faith understand some things about each other. That they're devoted to something more than just what they see around themselves. And people of deep faith, meaning spirituality, they also have a certain distinction from a common follower, in that the common follower may see their identity within a group or a certain type of practice or ideology, whereas a person pursuing spirituality wants to get the highest aspect of their religion out of that religion. Now, the only thing you have to be careful about as a Muslim is that we don't fall into the trap when we look at spirituality in other groups, like in yoga or in Buddhism or something else, is that we don't start to get into this trap that all religions are somehow leading to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or that all religions are somehow, they may have kernels of truth in them, right? They may have kernels of truth in them, but that somehow they're all valid or equal or universal. I think this is a trick that many Muslims end up can fall into when they appreciate, or they at least regard or admit, that other groups may have some types of wisdom teachings and some type of experience of an idea of a divine being. And that's why, because people who have not disciplined their minds or studied may fall into those traps, that's why the scholars traditionally just close it and say, no, you don't explore this and explore that and appreciate these teachings and that teachings. You stay within Islam, because the mind that is not trained or that is not mature in spirituality, Islamic spirituality, they can begin to get swayed by their emotions. So they hear a guru saying something very nice and they start to say, oh, wait a second, we have these teachings too. Maybe we're all the same. Maybe. And that's what gets off into that kind of like the goofy kind of, universalist type of thing. And people have gone astray because of that. So that's why the ulama were very, very conservative about that and saying, no, we don't need to look outside of that. And oftentimes the people's discourse to understand other religions is just to decrease attention. That why are we different from other people? Why is it that some people are going to heaven, some people are going to hell? Why can't we just resolve this? Because we're living in secular, multicultural societies. So it's a balancing act. I don't suggest for people to go looking around. Once they have Islam, you stay satisfied with the truth.
Do you want to go, Nadeem? Or
yeah, I think it's a really interesting point about disciplining the mind that you make there, and I'm interested to explore what that means from a counselling perspective. Because my wife's a counsellor actually, and we've kind of discussed this previously. But it's really interesting to me that actually some of the counselling can bring or heighten that disciplining of the mind, especially when it comes to things like sin and guilt. I think traditionally, some of the ways that we've handled it in our community and some of the advice that we've had previously in the communities hasn't really been useful or helpful, without trying to be saying anything bad about any of the ulama or anything like this. But I think with counselling, that can really help develop and discipline the mind and develop that spiritual kind of sense within a person. So I'm interested to explore that. If you have
I
any
mean,
thoughts on that.
yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I think what happens is the counseling culture that's come up is suited for the needs of our time. So our elders, the shuyukh and the imams and scholars, they didn't do that approach because the minds of people and the hearts of people were different, right? It was a simpler time, and in many ways, what I feel that um, practice was actually a little bit less, I would say, in the past. That's a funny thing. I would say a little bit less. Most people are more practicing than their parents, but the values were more deeply, the values are less today, even though practice is more today. And the practice was a little bit less back in the immediate past, but the values were higher in terms of the values of family, the values of gender, the values of propriety and ethics and these things. So the ulama of the past were dealing with people who did not need too much counseling and social working and explanation. We've come into a time now where we're very cerebral. We're very much in our minds now. We're isolated from each other. Most of us spend more time on the phone than we spend doing anything else, including anything, even work sometimes. So this all leads us to the point where we need a lot of talking to sometimes. We don't have as many peer mentorship relationships. We don't have as much social interaction. And so the mind starts to, because the mind is not born trained, it's not born disciplined, it just starts going all over the place. This idea, that idea. I mean, you scroll, and how many ideas do you come across, within a single session of just swiping and scrolling, watching different reels? You just get so many different ideas at you. So the mind is confused. Most people, they have a confusion about them. And when this combines with emotional vulnerability, a problem in your life, lifestyle bad habits or lifestyle crisis, maybe a relationship crisis, all of a sudden it leads the people into needing help. They enter a state of that crisis and a problem. That's when they turn to counseling. No one goes counseling just because, like, hey, I think it might be good to try. They go because it's a problem. And so the whole point of that counseling is it's somebody who has it together in a certain area or way. They're not perfect, but they are trying to talk to you to try to make you understand things in a more organized fashion, or at least in a fashion that allows you to consider different possibilities and come to conclusions on your own that will lead to a better outcome. So that disciplining of the mind. Now, there's a difference in different types of counseling. The kind of secular model of counseling is very much like, you suggest things, but you don't tell people things. You kind of lead the people here, lead the people there. What do you want to do? I don't know. Lead the people to make their own decisions. My style of counseling, I'm not like the clinical kind of like that counselor. I'm a religious, spiritual counselor from the Islamic side, which is sometimes Muslims just want to know, what do I have to do? Like and people just want to hear it straight. And so sometimes you do this type of, well, you decide. And sometimes when it comes to deen, I put on my other hat and I say, no, deen says this. Brother, you need to be doing this. Sister, this is not right. So this is like the balance between the two types of counseling. And the disciplining of the mind comes from learning, what the Sharia says about something, how human interaction should be governed, and then finally, just being aware of your own emotions.
Can I follow up on that, Tanzim, if you don't mind?
Go for it, yeah.
So something that really interested that I had really interesting a little while ago from Sheikh Suleiman Van El, who, if you were in Jordan at Qasid, that you may be familiar with him.
He's one of my teachers. He's one of my early teachers.
Okay, so then obviously you're very intimately familiar with him, and he's a psychotherapist as well. He mentioned in a class we did a few months back that if you have a particular sin, and within the kind of ambit of spirituality, if you have a particular sin that you can't get rid of, it's actually wajib for you to, I don't want to misquote him, but I believe he said it's wajib for you to seek professional help, some kind of counseling or something to that effect. So just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that as a counselor as well. I think in particular, with particular addictions and that sort of thing, which can be from traumas, right?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Sheikh Suleiman Van El, mashallah, he's a bit older than me. We're still the same generation. But when I came to Jordan, he had been in the Middle East for longer. He converted before I converted. And mashallah, brilliant man. I love him very much, mashallah, although we haven't met each other in many years. And alhamdulillah, I studied tajweed under him. I studied my first seerah text, or no, my second seerah text under him, mashallah, some of the 40 hadith as well. It was very nice, mashallah. And so he has a very good point about that. And this is why the scholars say, whoever does not go into the sciences of the heart to take out the diseases of their heart, they end their life. They pass their life and end it having committed major sins and not even realizing it. That's from the spiritual side, when we talk about the diseases of the heart. There are some just actual, real life worldly problems. You've got an addiction. You've got an abusive personality. You've got other tendencies that lead you towards sins, not just the inner sins like envy and jealousy or anger, but actually comes out into a behavior. This is where, no doubt, if it is wajib to stop a sin because it's haram to do a sin, then it's wajib to remove the habit of doing that sin too. And this is why it's not just tawbah. Tawbah is one way to start the journey of stopping, but it's taking the means. So if somebody cannot stop a sin without help, then the means of taking that help to stop the sin takes the ruling of stopping the sin, which is wajib. And so he's very right. If you need help and you can't do it on your own, I believe as well that it becomes, by extension, an obligation on you to seek treatment. Now, part of the problem is, in our societies, we see the masjid as like, okay, that we understand, going through the scholar, but we don't see going to a clinic, or we don't see going to a professional psychotherapist. We have not extended Islamic rulings in its proper ijtihad to encompass secular or worldly ways of getting treatment. And so I think that's an awareness that's coming about slowly, the need for mental health treatment, and there's a need for Muslim-sensitive mental health treatment for sure, because it's also an industry in the mainstream that's actually caused a lot of damage and harm. I'm going to be very, very honest. Psychotherapy has caused a lot of harm to the patients and also to the psychotherapists. I'm going to be very honest, by messing with their ideals and opening up things in their minds that they don't know how to govern if the deen is not governing their practice.
Have you found a tussle between, like you just touched on there, Shaykh, about like the maybe so-called secular counselling versus the Islamic counselling? Like I'm sure you said you may not be like that clinical counsellor. I'm sure you within the circles of non-Muslims that were considered as counsellors, and they may feel judgment or judgment for your principles and standing up for what Islam has to say in a counselling environment versus, I guess what, like I remember I forgot we had an episode with, but they basically said like they diagnosed even aspects of someone's belief system. Like obviously in Islam we believe angels and day of judgment, all of that, and then from a clinical counseling perspective, they might diagnose that as an issue, like this guy has strange beliefs or something. So just curious about your experience.
Right. So what I've noticed, what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of damage being caused by the mental health industry, whether it's psychotherapy, whether it's spiritual healing, and all these types of things that are trying to fix what's wrong with man. The solutions often, because they're not guided by deen. I'll give you a couple of examples. A brother comes to me with a pornography addiction, and his previous therapist had said, what's wrong with having an addiction to pornography? You're a young man. You can't get married right now. Your religion is telling you something that's not natural, and it's natural to be interested in pornography. So therefore, just keep going. No problem. And so, okay, maybe to relieve the guilt and the tension, but that wasn't the right message to give a young Muslim man who's struggling with this. Same thing with same-sex attraction, for example, the kind of advices that you're going to hear. I'll give you another one, especially in like the healing industry, where I've seen like Muslim psychotherapists, for example, if they are also not very disciplined and kept in a, keep close contact with other fellow clinicians and therapists who are grounded in deen, they might be promoting, in order to cross-promote, they promote a non-Muslim, let's say, who's offering, heal your inner child, trauma workshop, bonding, masculinity training, femininity training. And little do you know, in their events, in their retreats, they are doing mushroom microdosing. They're using drugs. And when I confronted this practitioner, who's not a Muslim, I said, hey, I'm just a religious clergy, and I'd like to know a little bit about your treatment. Is it true that you use drugs in your treatment? He said, well, I don't consider mushrooms a drug. I consider it a sacred plant. But we don't use pills. And that was his big thing. So I said, oh, okay. So now Muslim men are going to go to a retreat to heal their inner child and get into manliness, masculinity kind of healing and repair. And you're offering in the fine print somewhere, you're offering mushroom microdosing, calling it a sacred plant. Now, if Muslim psychotherapists and people in that field are not very careful, in order to be one with the field and in order to be accepted in the broader field, they may actually channel people into the wrong path. And you think you went to a Muslim psychotherapist. So now it becomes more important than ever to say first, okay, you have to have a suspicion. Now, there are some treatments and some modalities that, okay, like, you have a straight problem, like depression, anxiety, even OCD, many ways, okay, you go to a non-Muslim practitioner. Don't be afraid of the field. But if it comes to moral and ethical questions, that can only be solved by a Muslim practitioner who's grounded in deen. And the first thing they need to know is that their aqidah and their worldview has to be intact, even if they're not that practicing. Even if that psychiatrist or psychotherapist is not super practicing, but their worldview and their aqidah has to be at least intact enough to know that what they convey to you reflects your own beliefs and values.
I'm glad you brought up the whole drug-induced spirituality, if that's the right word to call it, because I'm curious to get your thoughts about, like, there's this whole movement, especially in a modern culture. I think it kind of sparked off from Joe Rogan, to be honest. Like, you start talking about DMT, like in every podcast episode, and then people have started talking about ayahuasca, going to the forests and all that, and having these experiences. So you mentioned about microdosing and that sort of means as well, or using that to heal the inner child, or for whatever means the secular sort of spiritualist uses. So maybe it's like two-part question, but my first question would be, do they actually work in the sense of seeing certain realities that we as a normal human being wouldn't be able to otherwise see, or can it be channeled in a way Islamically, quote unquote? And then secondly is like, why should Muslims actually stay away? Like, obviously from Islamic tradition it's not prohibited, and that's why you're bringing up as a concern, but I'm just curious as to why that's the case. Because someone could come back and ask the question like, maybe using those drugs has made me have a better relationship with Allah or something, because it gave me clarity. And a lot of people may say that with ayahuasca, like, or even other types of drugs. So I'm just curious to know, hear your experiences around that.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't had experiences with the drugs, so I can't exactly say what happens, alhamdulillah. I mean, but I can say that, look, there's a reason why intoxicants were prohibited, because they cloud over the mind. When you cloud over the mind, the types of actions that you may do are not conducive to a good life, a wholesome life that is pleasing to Allah. And it may cause harm, and a society cannot function if everybody is high on drugs and constantly trying to take drugs to escape. If there was a need, and if Allah knew that only through drugging yourself and basically exploring inner dimensions, or trying to open a door, that was the only way of getting through your trauma, then the Sharia would have allowed it. It's important to understand this. The Sharia would have allowed it. So you can take a medicine to relieve pain, even though like morphine, if it's needed, may Allah protect us. But you can take certain drugs that may cloud over for a certain reason, for a certain time. But when it becomes a lifestyle, when it becomes something accepted, when it becomes something morally made neutral, and this is what's happening in the field. They're saying morally, this is a neutral thing, this is fine, and you can do it as long as you need. Now, healing through trauma and layers of trauma, this is not something that happens in a day and a night. It is something that happens over a long period of time. And if there are other means, that are used, and traditional societies have shown this, modern psychiatry has shown this as well, that the research, you can do it without getting involved in substance abuse, essentially. Given as well that we're in a time of legalization of drugs and more substance abuse than has ever happened before, isn't it kind of suspicious that they also happen to be bringing this into medical treatments? I mean, to now justify, a respectable doing of this. So, for example, marijuana has become legalized. All of a sudden, it's become almost like not respectable, but it's not become stigmatized to be walking around my neighborhood and I smell weed like right from your front door, Or I'm taking my kids in a park and I'm smelling weed. What is this? This used to be growing up as a non-Muslim. This used to be something you hide and you do. It's an illegal activity. But now it's become something that's mainstream. How do we stop the fact that now, forget Muslim youth, their parents, their adults are getting into weed. I mean, I'm counseling parents who are addicted to weed, husband and wife together. So what kind of household are you going to raise? What kind of values? And also, what is going to be your view if you make these adjustments in your aqidah and in your fiqh? Because when you change a ruling of Islam, it's not a fiqh disagreement at that point. It's your worldview. It comes into your beliefs in your aqidah itself. When you start making those minor adjustments, you change your lifestyle. There's one thing to say, yeah, I'm a sinner, I have a bad habit. But to say, yeah, this is so great, we're going to open a door, meditation, we need this. All of a sudden, you open that door to the rest of the community. And this is when you get a whole society awash with things like drugs, things like New Age spirituality. Do you think that's bringing you closer to Islam or further? Oh, no, it's bringing me closer to Islam, getting closer to Allah. Okay, now we know for sure that this person is misguided. And this is why people need to speak up about this phenomenon that's happening and say, I don't care how much mumbo jumbo you know. Is this leading to a right path? Because let me see the rest of your actions. I don't think it's going to put you on your 5 prayers. I don't think it's going to put you, get you away from illicit sexual relations. I don't think it's going to. So what you realize is taking down a path where you're following those people down their path. Don't tell me as a Muslim it's been good for you. Oh, but you don't know how much I've suffered. This is the only thing that's given me relief. Okay, if you're saying that everything can be justified to give you relief, right, to make you feel better, to do what you want, then I'm sorry, then there's no more need for rules because everybody just does what they want. So this is obviously something that's the antithesis of religion, but it's being used by Muslims to kind of like soft launch acceptance of these aspects. And it's all tied in drug use, New Age religion, gender distortions, sexuality distortions. They're all kind of tied up. It's the Prophet ﷺ, he said something amazing. Millatul kufr wahid, hadith. That the nation of kufr is really actually one. In its forms, it changes. In its disciplines, it changes. But the ideas are all there. And that is, do not follow revelation strictly. And you're going to see the consequences of that.
I've spoken to one of my teachers, Dr. Samir Mahmood. We had a similar discussion, and so a lot of people use those drugs to induce a level of spirituality. And he basically said to me that the reason why it's a false spirituality is because they experience a crash the next day or the day after, right? So true spirituality you shouldn't have a crash, right? So I guess from a basic standpoint, theologically speaking, we are doing actions because for the sake of Allah, we want to do it because we want to follow, the guidance and everything in order to obviously please Him and get into Jannah. So I think there's obviously Allah has given that gift of that experiencing that spirituality in those actions, and 100%, not that I've done any of those drugs or know what it's like, but I've actually had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, not necessarily Muslim, but non-Muslims, with how they perceive it, because they try to equivocate all to the same as, oh yeah, I'm doing my own kind of spirituality, there's Islamic spirituality. Right. Nothing even compares to no drug can induce that level of the light in your heart that you attain from strictly following the Sharia and having that love of Allah and doing azkar in the morning and nighttime. There's this presence that's unmatched like any other drug, because the other drugs are they make you a bit more, not to say they make you more spiritual, maybe see things in a different way that isn't what they may have been looking at the world previously, but it doesn't it is essentially dunya oriented in the sense that they might become better at work, or they see a light and then they discover that what their true responsibilities are, or question a bit of the existence and their existence, or how the universe has been created, all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't actually translate to, I guess the perspective is the Islamic, so it can't be the same on those grounds. And unfortunately, people try to make it one and the same, but it's artificial, induced spirituality is never going to work, and it never attains. And that's why it gives that yaqeen, right, in my tradition, that in Islam that Allah has given us, through the Prophet has given us this gift. All we need to do is follow it, and through that gift we'll experience these beautiful feelings in the heart. We feel that contentment, peace, But that's like a reward, I guess, or Allah has given that, like, that it's like a rahmah in the sense that, like, it's not like the more spiritual we get or the more actions we follow, the feeling gets worse. Like, Allah's actually kind of made it, instilled that bit of I don't know, motivation. Like, okay, this is a bit of, the gift that you experience in your heart, and you just keep following that path. But we don't do the actions for the sake of feeling that experience.
Right.
Like, I spoke to the founder of he did an episode with us on Mizan Avenue. Shout out to Malik. He was saying that it was a beautiful story. I'm never going to forget. He said that he was on, I think, Umrah or Hajj, and he's been a few times, but one of the times he went, he said, like, he was at the Kaaba, he didn't feel anything, and then he went back after, like, to his hotel and thought, like, astaghfirullah, of a dead heart, like, a lot of work to do, this and that. And he opened up Michael Sulguge's book, and I think there's one part where it says that, Islam isn't about feelings, like, and he's like, subhanallah, like, happened to open up to that exact page, and then, understand that you're not always gonna, feel that spiritual, but that's a reminder that, it's not all about the spiritual, like, that feeling, sometimes it's not going to be easy, but yeah.
That's a big problem. Chasing the feeling, we've confused spirituality for chasing feelings and passing emotions that are positive. So spirituality can also be very, you can be very deflated as well in spirituality. You can be very sad too. You can be angry too. So, but if their version of spirituality is just to be jubilant and joyous all the time, they're actually missing the point. It's to come out of these states of going up and down and be with Allah regardless of your state. But if you don't have a concept of Allah to be with, you're going to just want to be in a happy state, because for you, you're just avoiding harm or pain. Whereas we know that for us as Muslims, that's not always the case. It's about being with Allah no matter where you are. And that is the ultimate spirituality, right? That's why people going through problems can feel close to God. Why? Because that's the highest level. That's the highest joy, right? If not in this world, in the next world especially. Now, the thing is that what Islam promises, differently than what these New Age types of things are promising, is that Islam is saying, first of all, you are enough. You, as broken as you are, you are enough, that Allah is enough, and that you and Allah is what you really need on that path. And when you look at all these other isms and the substances and the ideologies, is it making stable families? Like the same trauma that you went through, so and so, to come into these types of programs and to try to do these things, the same trauma that you experienced because of the breakdown of society, number one, or the lack of holistic religion. So many Muslims are traumatized by Muslim experiences. They are. Let's not lie. But it's because of the breakdown of holistic experiences and community and balance, a prophetic balance. So no matter how you came to that trauma and why you are so wounded, is the solution causing you to be part of a solution in your families and in your communities? And the answer is often no. The answer is often, it just teaches me to be independent and isolated. So they know how to open up problems. They know how to diagnose. They know how to label everything. But in the end, it comes back to the nafs. Me, myself, never tell you how to work something out with somebody else. Never tell you how to solve your problems in a society. Tells you rather, you do you and get away from what you don't like. If that's the one solution for everybody, well, then yeah, then drug use and porn is going to be pretty much, the solution to all your problems in the modern society.
I think that's,
this is where Islam differs, right? This is why we have a different promise in Islam.
I think it's a really interesting point you raised about the religious trauma, and I actually wanted to I've made a note of that actually to ask you about that, because that does seem like such a huge block for a lot of people, and somehow some people even leave the deen because of it. So how do we begin to kind of heal from that as individuals, as a community? I think you made a very important point there about actually healing as communities from that religious trauma that we may have suffered.
It's a very, very good question. Listen, we have to remember something. Not only have we suffered from it, we may be inflicting it on others as well. And so it takes an honest look at ourselves, right? And saying, am I part of this problem because of the way I think? Maybe I haven't hurt anybody, but am I furthering a mentality that would hurt other people. So understanding what harm is, what dhulm is, I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to now walk on that path and that realization, especially for those people closest to me. How have I been part of a mentality, right? Because you can't blame and outsource everything. At some point in time, everyone's buying into whatever the community is on. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, are we reflecting the prophetic model as a community in every single aspect of it? Maybe there are times because of post-colonial trauma and the breakdown of our Muslim societies that we didn't have aspects of the prophetic example preserved. Even though we've had religion preserved, we've had many things. But there are some aspects that could have come into our marriages, our child rearing, our educational techniques, our politics, our masjid relations, neighborly relations that are not prophetic. And it's okay to say that this is not right. Now, grounded by Quran and Sunnah and the traditional teachings of our scholars, it's okay now for some people to say, yeah, we used to do it like that, but we don't do it like that anymore, because this is a more prophetic way that is grounded in our tradition and more honors the Quran and Sunnah. And when we try to do that as a community level, then the other thing is trying to make sure that we don't get isolated. We have to start to keep the contacts with each other. Because even religious people can become very isolated, which leads them, the Prophet ﷺ said that the wolf only eats the sheep that has gone astray from the flock. So staying in a healthy community. And if your community around you is not healthy and it's toxic for whatever reason, having options to withdraw from that and go to another group or jama'ah or circle, not talking about a sect or an order, but what I mean is surrounding yourself in positive company, right? Whether it's a masjid or it's an MSA or just a group of friends. Finally, the other thing is we have teachings in our masajid that and our places of gathering, just like this, conversations like this, that lead us all to a better place. We have to remember that we are all a little wounded, and we may all be doing a little wounding to others if we're not careful. So it's just like we have to have that self-realization. So on an individual level, we have to be humbled and we have to say, is my nafs in this? Where's my ego in all of this, right? And I think that humbling and the teachings of trying to humble oneself through that and realizing maybe not one teacher has everything. Maybe not one, place of instruction teaches you everything you need to know. Maybe there's flaws that they had. Just being open and saying, okay, I'll take the good and I'm going to move on and I'm going to leave the bad and I'll move on from that and take the good from different places. As long as we're all on the same belief, all on the same platform. And there may be things that non-Muslims have that are very, very useful. Even relationship advice, child rearing advice, some of it may be very useful. This is where we need trusted people who have studied and who have gone through keeping company with prophetic exemplars to take that information and bring it into the Muslim community in a way that's healthy for us.
So how do we, as you said, you mentioned earlier on, it's you may be doing sins you're not even aware of, and I'm sure you've probably come across it in your practice. My wife has definitely come across in her practice where, people split the personalities. They have a personality at home and in the masjid, and when they're at work in a different setting, they've got a different personality, and they may not even be aware that they're doing it, and they're kind of inflicted by some wound, or they've been forced to lock off a part of their personality. Right. How can we start to recognize that within ourselves and remove that block in being complete holistic Muslim personality?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I realized I was doing that too. So not just like that person, he's doing it. No, we're all doing this perhaps to some extent. But for me, the way I see it is there's two ways that it can happen. Number one is either you drop the ego and you listen to people around you honestly. You listen to what they're saying and then take the means to addressing that. That's the best way. But oftentimes people who think they know, and there's many things I thought I knew, but I was humbled. And the second way is that Allah humbles you in some way. Allah humbles you in some way where you might not like it, but then you're forced to face yourself in a mirror. And then you're forced to say, okay, Allah, why did I have this experience? Because I had to learn something. Okay. And then you embark on a journey to try to learn it. And you see that as a blessing from Allah. So it's either this way or it's this way, right? As they say, whoever does not come towards Allah with the gentle breezes of his guidance will be pulled to Allah in the chains of tribulation. May Allah protect us. But sometimes we have this experience that forces us, it breaks us down, it makes us say, who are we? That's a time, that's actually a blessing from Allah, if it means that we'll improve. So having this split personality, the way that we solve it, from what I at least am trying to do for myself, I'm not even trying to say this for others, is that we just keep looking honestly at what was the Prophet ﷺ like. That is really our exemplar. And what are the best practices that our community, our teachings have to offer, and constantly saying, how can I improve? When we become that improvement, we automatically become a light for other people around us, the closest people first, and then people around us. And that's where you see the improvement in the community, I think. Inshallah.
I think it's speaking from my own personal experience, that journey through knowledge. I think what really humbled me was learning Tajweed, because it's such a difficult and arduous process. I love it. I love Tajweed. I love the intricacies of the rules and everything. And then just practicing it. You practice for a week and you go and read to your sheikh and he's like, no, this is completely wrong.
Exactly.
And then you improve and you get better. And then you listen to someone like, Sheikh Minshawi, rahimullah, or someone, or Hasani, rahimullah, and you're like, how is this possible? How is so I think, when I started that journey, it was I think what you're saying, what you just said, that really became clear to me when I started that journey in Tajweed and
Mashallah, I was speaking about more like life-changing events, because sometimes we realize, it could be in studies, for example, that you become humbled, and sometimes it could be at work, sometimes it could be in your relationships, sometimes it could be in your health, sometimes it could be in your own personality, that you just flip out and you realize, what the heck, I thought I was a religious person, right? Why am I, or your attitudes, where your nafs is challenged by something, somebody corrects you and you resist, and you're like, wait, why am I resisting? So sometimes another really good solution is being around prophetic people, being around healed people, wholesome people, and just observing them, and then putting yourself against them, right? And saying, and that may change in your phase of life. When you're young, the type of person you take as your exemplar may be very different. As you reach middle age or older age or different stages of life, as you're a parent, as a spouse, as a leader in a community, a halaqah, teacher or something, all of a sudden the people that you need to be looking at may be changing all the time. So we also have to be looking at, who can I keep mentoring and modeling off of? And the beauty is, it all comes from the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
In terms of, I think going back to a previous conversation, I think, and this includes as well, like spirituality, like, alhamdulillah, like we're fortunate that in our tradition we have a guide and we follow the ways of the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore the seerah becomes really important to understand and really come to terms with, like we were talking about as well, with emotions and feelings and feeling that high. But then if you think about it, like the Prophet ﷺ went through the most hardship, right? But then is still the most beloved to Allah. So that kind of relationship might be I guess the non-Muslim might look at that and be a bit confused. It's like, okay, the Prophet ﷺ didn't just get everything handed on a silver platter, right? Had to go through a lot of turmoil, a lot of difficult situations in order to allow for Islam to spread and facilitate that, and then taken up by the rest of the companions as well. So, like, I think it's always important to have that connection to the seerah and really understand it. Like, that's probably, like you're talking about your transformation, Nadeem. That was probably personally for me, like actually doing a proper deep dive study into the seerah to really connect with the emotions and feelings and certain situations and certain behaviors. The process I'm demonstrated where it's like, okay, this is like unlike any other human. This is like the perfect guide for us to inshallah emulate as the best as we can in order to be pleased in the sight of Allah as well. So
no doubt. But remember something, everybody interprets the Prophet ﷺ according to the limit of their understanding of him, right? So the funny thing is, you could have somebody who has the entire seerah in front of them, but they can't see certain teachings of mercy, for example, or they cannot see where the Prophet ﷺ was strict and harsh at some times. Why? Because their mind only takes from it what serves and suits them. And this is why sometimes the looking at exemplars, people who have passed it on and embodied it, is so important, because you'll only extract what you understand. You'll only take from it what you can, your cup, whatever size your cup is, that's all you can fill up. But the thing is, when you take when you basically are taking from another cup that's bigger, that becomes yours. So you actually kind of expand your cup. That's what we should be doing. What I realize is actually expanding our understanding of saying, where are my faults? Oh Allah, show me my faults so I can make tawbah from them and change. That's the person who has mercy from Allah. And I think it may actually be that sometimes the best practice of something is not even with a Muslim right now. It could be with somebody else, but it's just understanding how to take that in a controlled fashion without taking the bad stuff. That's the challenge of our time right now as well.
I'm glad you brought that up as well, Sheikh, because I think it's super important. Like even aside from the Sirah as well, like even when people read the Quran or Muslims read the Quran, because of the cup that they the limit of their cup, they only take away X amount of information or extract X amount of benefit. But it's also important that as the person themselves, because we obviously have different, like you, I, Nadeem, we all have different lenses, right? We're not all the same people, right? So we'll obviously see things a little differently. It's not always going to be the same, right? So we'll always see according to our lens of how we've been shaped and how we've grown up, our nature, nurture, etc. And so it's really important to intellectually also try to, grow, and also like try to, as you said, like sit with the people that can facilitate wisdom and spirituality, and they'll expand that cup, and therefore we'll be able to extract more. Like I think that's one of the beautiful things about the universality aspect of the Quran. Like no matter if you're just starting out and you're reading the Quran versus up until when you're 80, 90 years of age, there's always some benefits to extract from the Quran. Like always, no matter how much wisdom you've accumulated, it's always teaching us something, right? And I think that's to be like, I remember like, it's kind of ties in with this eureka moment that I may have had, in the sense that like, when Allah talks about, in regards to theology versus like observing nature, and I started realizing like when my teachers gave me that understanding of, okay, like for example, when Allah talks about people that deny a hereafter, right? And then Allah says, no, like just like the plants grow when it's watered, right? Or the earth is watered and it comes back to life, Allah will raise you like that on the day of judgment, right? And I'm like, yeah, like you sort of read passing, it's like, okay, like we'll be raised. But then when you actually have that like cup of understanding, like, wait, theologically, people make that question of trying to argue Islamic points, but no, Islam is congruent with nature, what we observe in the world, what Allah has created the universe. Theology and the nature are congruent, right? So the more that like, and I've had that kind of eureka moment from my teachers, like reflecting more on nature, understanding how, I don't know, the water works, or how the earth interacts with the water, all these sort of things. Once you observe and take that time, that spiritual plane, or through meditation and doing Islamic spirituality, that facilitated more of my understanding on like, subhanAllah, like how beautiful the Quran is even more. So that can only happen, like, praise my teachers, obviously them guiding me and showing me that, but it also takes groundwork to be able to sort of make that cup bright. Not that I've achieved anything, but it's just kind of my little experience of, I'm like, wow, like I have so much to learn and experience, right? But I think people sort of stop at like, unfortunately, like many might just see Islam as rules and regulations. It kind of stops there. Like, okay, we just have to follow it and that's it. But there's more than that, right? Like even in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, like Allah granted Yusuf alayhi salam like wisdom, and we can see like through his stories, there's always a lot of gems and to extract. But we just need to also do the groundwork spiritually and otherwise in our intellectual capacity as well.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier on about masculinity. I think that's such an important topic for today, and these kind of masculine training courses and stuff, right? I think there's a growing movement within some Muslim circles to copy or do similar things, or try and use some of these masculine courses and then repackage them. I mean, from my perspective, I think there's a lot there. I mean, we discussed it last time's episode, in terms of Italy, and talking about how a lot of this is capitalist and kind of just framed to get men to be, to make more money, basically, or pursue more dunyawi things, right? Yeah, exactly. That sort of stuff. Now, I mean, from my perspective, I think there's a lot that's missing there, especially when it comes to spirituality, in terms of, like, like some of the terminology that Imam Ghazali uses or Ibn Qayyim uses in terms of how they approach Allah and solitude and longing and intimacy, and that sort of thing. So, I mean, what's your perspective on that? What's your perspective on this kind of masculinity courses as, someone who studied the Deen and obviously someone who's a counselor, and how much can we really take from them? And, how much can we develop our spirituality without developing that tenderness and that kind of like emotional openness to be able to, as these great scholars say, present your heart, present your soul to Allah, right?
Right. Right. Listen, whatever the masculinity industry right now is giving, I'm going to be honest, it's definitely needed. Okay, it's definitely needed. Not just by the boys, because there's a real crisis among the boys, but among our generation as well. Me, particularly, I wish I had some of those teachings growing up. I would have benefited. Why? Why do I say that? We've all been raised as men in the modern world with a lot of we've been raised, let's say, especially if you're from certain cultural backgrounds, where your job is just to study and do well. You don't really help out much at home, and a lot of complaining, very soft culture. So when you get into your marriages and stuff like that, not really sure how to hold a frame of what the context of the marriage is going to be in, which is the guidance of the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And how you're going to behave as a masculine male coming forward, rather than somebody who is kind of like competing with a woman the woman feels like she has to kind of step up to be a man a little bit in order to get what she needs to survive in a marriage. There's a huge crisis. There's a crisis about that. There's no doubt about it. And I think that a lot of us can stand to benefit. I've certainly, seen that there's a lot of benefit that the generation of males that did not have to be the sole providers, for example, or it was not expected of them that they had to behave in a manly or chivalrous fashion. That generation took a big hit because that prophetic masculinity is still very sorely needed. The problem is this. When the gender breakdown happens, and I'm not an expert on this field, but I can just see from my own personal thing, is that, because the breakdown of societies, breakdown of gender, the gender wars started happening, there are people without guidance who realize that men are different. Okay, men are supposed to be different. This is not normal. So they decided to, let's start talking about manliness. But they did it combined without guidance in feeding into the values of the society itself. So all you're doing is just becoming like a top dog, top carnivore, get the women, get the capitalism, get that. Have discipline only for the sake of success. And so what ends up happening is you just become a very greedy, like a conqueror, like a warrior mentality. Okay, in some ways. But in some ways, you become a slave to your nafs. You become a slave to your desires, a slave to the idea of masculinity. Whereas when you look at in the past, men were men anyways. They didn't have to be defined how to be a man. Every man was a man in the past. You didn't have to tell, even scholars, like we think that it's all about like being really physically fit and being always ready to fight. Like there were scholars who were like, very, very meek, but they're still men in their minds. They're still men in their way of thinking. How does that mean? That's what the whole masculinity, Islamic prophetic masculinity will explore. What does that mean? And Islamically, what it meant, at least at the core, is an unwavering commitment to upholding the truth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala found in the Quran and the prophetic example, and taking your responsibility that Allah has given you very seriously and not compromising on it, nor seeking the comforts and luxuries and escapes that are typically assigned to the they call the fairer sex in that sense, and understanding the sacrifice involved in being a man, not taking just the advantages of it. So I think that the two things, that aspect that was taken for granted. This is why when they talk in the Islamic traditional sense, spiritually, of rujula, manliness, they talk about futuwa, chivalry. It's like, it wasn't about gender. Everyone was a man anyways. There was no man who wasn't a man. It was very rare to see that. But now it's like a men among men. What do they stand for? So for us, it was always a cut above what normal masculinity is. It's prophetic masculinity. That's what made the Prophet ﷺ the man's man, right? The epitome, the ultimate perfect man. So this is where our masculinity work, like I'm seeing Shaykh Abdullah Aduro, for example, from Yaqeen Institute, is doing work on masculinity. We're seeing Sheikh Dawood Walid, for example, from Detroit. He's talked about masculinity. We've got the Green Pill movement, brother Fahim Farouk, for example. I think it's called Green Pill Coaching. So there are people trying to say, listen, there's lots of masculinity talk out there, but let's bring this into the context of Islam. And not everyone's going to get it all right, but I will tell you, it has given me enough reason, even though I've had mentors who are very manly mentors and I've benefited from them. There's still a lot of work I have to do, and by corollary, many other men in my generation have to do, to try to get to that point that even the average manly man like my grandfather would have been like. And a lot of that starts from not whining, not complaining, doing hard work, not expecting an immediate payout, principle over pleasure. There's so many values that I'm really looking forward to see what we as a community now can bring together and help each other with, including fitness as well, including physical fitness, the idea of protectorship, the idea of qawama. Those are all very important.
I think it's the discipline is really key for me, I think. And I think, for instance, someone like Sheikh Nuh Keller, Hafidullah, like, someone who's so consistent in what he does day in, day out, very kind of simple routine, and yet so kind of profoundly attached to Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Vegetarian for most of the years, I understand, and yet that's not the picture that we often associate with being men, right? It's more like maybe not so much in the Islamic space, but I think within kind of the other space, it is kind of like take your pleasure as it comes and kind of grab it, and do what you want, kind of thing. Don't be controlled, be the person controlling, right?
Yeah, but that control, see, this is the thing. Every gender has its tests, okay? And there's a test that women have, for example, right? In terms of, let's say many of their inclinations and habits, and men have that too. And so, for example, I have to ask myself, am I just trying to be controlling for my nafs? And I had to ask myself that. Why am I trying to control people in ways that's not a manly thing to do? A manly man does also let go of control too, because he's got the bigger picture, right? And the biggest thing you can do is control your own self. So the most manly thing you can do is control your own self. And then a man who's in control of himself automatically controls aspects of his environment, because people who are around him who cannot control themselves, they immediately draw and they fall into line. This is not a religious truth. You can see this in the dunya as well. It's the CEO who controls and disciplines his habits of work becomes the leader. Militarily, the person who can discipline themselves. Sports-wise, politically, it's the ones who can bring themselves together. What we're talking about is that this is not uncivilized, manliness. Because you can be a caveman and be a man, a brute. But the Prophet ﷺ came to refine that toxic masculinity, as they call it, into real, true prophetic masculinity. And by corollary, that draws out the feminine Islamic femininity as well, you see? So it all goes back to, we have those teachings there. It may not be spelled out exactly, but you will see the glimpses of it in people's good example. And whatever you draw from that, that is the prophetic way, right? If it conforms with the Quran and Sunnah.
For me, I try to, when it comes to the topic of masculinity, I try to understand also the actions of the Prophet ﷺ and attaining the balance of knowing, like, there's going to be times where a man needs to, take initiative, right? There needs to be a time where, in obviously, like, as a husband or a father figure, you need to take lead and take control and be the shepherd, right? But a shepherd isn't controlling your every actions of the sheep, right? Like individually going up to them, controlling them. It's kind of guiding the way and knowing what to do or what to give to each person. So I love the analogy from Riyas al-Qadhi series where he talks about how prophets were all shepherds, and so when he was talking to shepherds, understanding what they do, right? every shepherd has to know each aspect of the sheep, because each sheep are different in the way they behave. One may be a bit more stubborn, one may be following the crowd, etc. So I think tying it back to masculinity, it's clear that obviously what you said, Sheikh, about controlling it is an aspect of the nafs. And for that, we need to forego that, but then also know what to give to each person in order to be in sync and harmony with their spirit or the way they see the world, and giving and then being that guide in that sense, rather than trying to control everything situation, because control can be fear of the future and fear of the unknown too, right? And that could be analysis of why someone is controlling. So that aspect is always about balance, right? And knowing when to be like that or when not to be like that. Like, it's not dictated by your nafs, right? It's dictated by the principles as following the Sharia and trying to please Allah. And it's very obviously antithesis to what modern day and age, and kind of obviously goes back to everything we discussed about spirituality. But I think, like knowing when to be, because a lot of people, they may have that inclination to be, because of their extroversion nature, be a little bit more controlling compared to an introverted person. But I think it's also important to highlight, when it comes to masculinity and that balance, that even the introverted person, like they may be seen as great and wonderful because they're quiet, they're not like filling up the space, hearing their own sound of their voice, right? But that introverted person also needs to learn when to take initiative or when to like speak up against injustice, and that requires a sort of balance, right? So conversely, we may be speaking about the person that's a bit more extroverted and controlling and honing it in, right? And being balanced, knowing when to not be controlling, etc. But I think it's also equally as important to know or note that the introverted person that is going to be a bit shy, is not going to naturally want to take initiative, right? Which the extroverted person finds natural, but they need to also balance themselves and know when to take initiative, right? When to speak up, when they might be, in their own self, from a very emotional standpoint, not inclined towards doing that. So I think, it's not like a flick of the switch and it all happens. It obviously takes a lot of refining of character, understanding your nafs, and putting the things in place in order to facilitate the right behavior in the right moment. So like, even when speaking, when not to speak, not when to debate someone or when to debate someone, like all these kind of aspects. Or like, I think even on an interpersonal standpoint, like relationship with finances, like, I mean, I think like for me, like reading Richard Kiyoshi's book, what to do with, I forgot the book, skipping my mind, but he talks about like the psychology of money, right? Like emotional standpoint. I think that's also a good lens to understand a person's nafs, in the sense that, okay, are they just willing to just kind of spend, will be in the moment and be a bit carefree, versus someone that's a bit more disciplined. But I also feel that someone that is very stingy or disciplined, that's an excess, and that's also mentioned obviously in the Quran. That's why we need to balance ourselves and become charitable, right? Facilitate that balance. But conversely, we should know, I think the right balance is to obviously be charitable and know, like, okay, give to others and help out, but also be strict on ourselves in the way we spend, but also be charitable. So it's about knowing when to be charitable and not, when to be disciplined or a bit more disciplined. So all this is, I think, under the umbrella of masculinity, balance, taming the nafs as well, that kind of things. And it's all interlinked, and and it's always important to understand where we need to stand as from a principle standpoint, and to know what we're naturally inclined to as people. Everyone's obviously different, but then kind of work towards being balanced, inshallah.
MashaAllah.
So with respect to kind of some of the levels of spirituality, right? I've always been fascinated when Allah Azza wa Jalla talks about, for example, in Surah Bayyinah, ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ خَشِيَ رَبَّهُ, right? So that khashiyah, that awe of Allah Azza wa Jalla, right? How do we kind of achieve that? Because that seems like, to me, in my kind of like, unpad, my layman's kind of understanding, there's khawf, there's taqwa, there's that kind of like fear of Allah, but then there seems to be that awe of Allah. Like, how do we start to develop that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a very, very high question, because I mean, to explain like, oh well, I have khashya, anybody who can say something like that is really misguided, because khashya is a higher level than khawf. That's what we do know. It is a type of awe, But one thing we do realize is that the fear of Allah is not the same as the love of Allah, in the sense that, in the Western sense, they say fear God, and they get really uncomfortable with that. For us, when we say fearing Allah, we don't fear the that of Allah, the being of Allah. Allah is not scary, but we fear disconnecting from Allah. We fear the punishment of Allah. We fear crossing Allah's limits. And so that's very important. That we love Allah's being itself. We love Allah Himself, right? And we love being connected to Him. This is where that balance comes. The fear of Allah, the first thing that it tells us is that we have a Lord who is over us. That person who knows, I'm not giving a tafsir, but I'm saying, that person who knows that Allah is above them, Allah is controlling them, Allah has every right over them. They don't want to cross the limits that Allah has placed over them, right? They don't want to do any dhulm to their own souls, and they don't want to do dhulm to those around them. And when they do, they realize and they repent. They try to make amends for it. They try not to do anything that crosses the Sharia of the Prophet ﷺ that he brought. So all of these things are a consciousness of Allah that should bring about a change in one's character and behavior. It's not about how necessarily how many tears you cry. That's also a very big thing. But it's really, or like how much you act like you're scared of Allah. But it's really, what is your way of conduct? That's what Allah is going to see at the end of the day. How are we? How were you actually? And so your state is reflected by your actions, and enough actions becomes a spiritual state. That spiritual state, when you stay on it, it becomes like the station of where you are. And so if you're a person who fears God, then you're going to be a person who does not want to cross anything that Allah said don't cross. And you will do everything that Allah said to do. And I think, speaking of myself, I'm a work in progress on that. So it's a very high level. May Allah make us understand a little bit of it. Ameen.
And it seems like it's in that same surah, Allah mentions, and again, it's my own personal reflections on that surah, that there's a particular punishment for the non-believers and there's a particular reward for the believers, right? But it's interesting to me that there's a separation between Allah and the non-believers, and how He kind of, they will be in Jahannam. And when it comes to the believers, He's saying that the reward is with Allah, and He's pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. So it seems like, it's just such a sad reality, subhanAllah, that anyone can be disconnected from their Lord. Because it's in Surah Ankabut, isn't it? No, not Surah Ankabut. It's in لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على الجبل لرأيته من خشية مصدع من خشية الله, right? And even like the rest of creation has that kind of connection with Allah, and you can have people who are completely disconnected and not have any sort of relationship with Allah.
This is a strange thing. This is the strange thing about humanity, that Allah made all of creation very well aware of who Allah is. Even though they don't have the faculty of thinking in the same way. They don't have the faculty of reasoning. So you may think, this computer, this glass, this rock, it's dumb. But it knows the one thing it needs to know, which is Allah is my Lord. At least we know that it knows that. And humankind, on the other hand, the faculty of our minds are so brilliant. Like, I'm talking to you in the UK and yourself in Australia. Like, who thought this was possible? We're seeing each other real time. And then we're going to record this and others are going to be watching it. And yet people know all these things, but they don't know their Lord. This is the real test that Allah has created, that I can teach you many different types of knowledge, but is it going to cloud the knowledge of Allah and the knowledge of Deen from your heart? That is really one of the big tests of our time. It's not just materialism. It's not just right action. It's really, if I open the doors of how this world works to you, will it distract you from who created the world for you? That's the whole test. And that's going to be the difference between us and the other side in that sense. Hopefully we're on the us, meaning the believers, and on the other side in the sense that you're seeing it already, the have and the have-nots, the developed world, the undeveloped world. You're seeing that, okay, people have advanced, like they are so far, the discrepancy between the, let's say, former colonial powers, they're still colonial powers, and the Muslim world is like, this discrepancy worldly wise is so much. I think it's almost impossible to try to catch up in that sense. In a worldly sense, Allah opened so much to them, but it took them away from Allah. And so that knowledge became a curse. It did not benefit them. And many times when we ask what went wrong with the Ummah, what went wrong? My personal belief and theory is that around the time when the Muslim world was becoming colonized and conquered, let's say, late 1700s, 1800s, especially, but nail in the coffin was like, World War I and going on, then really Allah was not honoring these people by giving them more knowledge, because they ended up using it and devolved in their morality. They devolved in their family life. They devolved in their humanity, basic humanity. Whereas we have a lot of problems, and we still do in the Muslim world, but there's still something basic, decent. There's a faith, there's family, there's still things that are good, that are preserved, but we lost the world and our position in order to realize what we really have. And so I feel that Allah opened all these knowledges in the Industrial Revolution and this revolution, that, the nuclear age, and threw all those other people under the bus and saved us by making us enslaved to other people, by making us colonized, by making us invaded and conquered. So we never were able to get into the form of discovery that made us misguided, because maybe it wasn't meant for us. Maybe it wasn't good for us. Maybe Allah knew, if I give that knowledge to you people, you will also go astray. So I want to keep you in a different way. And alhamdulillah, now we're seeing the benefits is coming so clear. All right, even with this whole Gaza crisis, may Allah, give them freedom and from oppression and liberation. I mean, you're seeing humanity is so clearly demarcated and delineated. And we may not be the ones powerful, we may not be the ones on top, but we sure as heck are happy that we're on the side of truth. We are sure as hell happy. Sorry to use that language, but we are very, very happy that we would rather side with seeing right for right and wrong for wrong. At this point, it doesn't matter who has the nuclear power. It doesn't matter who has all the technology. It doesn't matter who has the media, because alhamdulillah, we have the truth, we have the haqq. And if you want to give that up just to be one of the winners, quote unquote, in the dunya, and leave our people of Gaza, in the situation they're in, no, those are the winners. They understood the point of life. Even if it's not willing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed us through this, for example, what we really have as Muslims. So it's more incumbent now on us to preach that, to teach that to our youngsters, to use social media and every single means to stay firm on that message, more than ever.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this the other day, actually. Sorry, Tanzim, I think I cut you off there. I think I was thinking about this the other day as well. And subhanAllah, when we saw at the beginning of the kind of tragedy and the genocide in Gaza that people were becoming Muslim, that there's an undescribable joy in knowing that our messenger is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there's an undescribable joy in knowing that our Lord is Allah, right? And that's something that can never be taken away from us. And that's something I think a lot of people are now seeing. I don't want to rationalize the genocide in Gaza, or kind of like, talk about in romantic sense, but there is something that occurred at some point, when they were kicked off, and people, I think, saw that there's just this joy that cannot be taken away from us. We can still do our Mawlid, Qasida, we can still sing praises of Allah, and so on. And that joy and that kind of, it just cannot be taken.
No, sure, alhamdulillah. We have a very rich tradition, whichever path within that tradition you choose to follow. There is so much that's there that why would we give this up? Like, why would we give this up for the ways of this world? And yes, we do enjoy things from the world. We like our food, we like our dress, we like our conveniences. We have to admit, we have these weaknesses as well. We ask Allah to guide us in how we consume and how we benefit from those things. We like our social media, but at the same time, we know it's not, it's not the essence of life. It's not the crux of the reality and the eternal truth. And so we do feel good now, realizing that, while the entire time people were like, look at, religion, it's not that good, it's kind of boring, it's kind of whatever. Like, no, actually, I feel like, we've got humanity left. We have our humanity. Can we say that about vast swaths of people? They're just losing their humanity. And we say, alhamdulillah, that we didn't have the things opened up to us that they did. And that took them away from that path. And they're finding out more and more. People who are realizing my life was pretty empty. I was entering into a place where, there are other people. That's why they're becoming Muslim today. Alhamdulillah.
I was having these discussions about rationality, reason, skepticism with other friends that are Muslim. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, like maybe 6 years ago when I was arguing or debating these kind of people, you sort of just, because of my lack of understanding of spirituality at that time and being acquainted with people, you just kind of take it on face value and whatever. But then now, I don't know, I find it like a waste of time, number one. Number two, it's like, if you claim to just only use reason and logic, quote unquote, as the only way to see the world, it's like, what a sad world you live in, honestly. Because you're doubting everything around you. Therefore, like, how are you going to really experience? If anything, it's an imbalance of that person's character. That's number one. If you only see the world as like as a computer, like you just put in some codes and then you just go about life like that, like you're not going to actually experience the fullness and the beauty that Allah has given us in the creation that we can experience, right? So that's unfortunate, right? And the spirituality, they'll never understand. Like they'll never, feel the feeling of deep poetry or Allah's scriptures, all that sort of stuff. It's long and gone, right? And so for me, It's like it's kind of a useless thing to do. Like after realizing, like actually using reason and logic as a means, it's like why, obviously, like there's ways to argue around it. So like Ghazali talk about why. Because he went through a process of skepticism, and then he writes it in his books as well, Deliverance of Error. And it's like you have to be skeptical of your use of skepticism. So it's like you're in a bind, right? And but it's really interesting. And then he makes that point for tasawwuf, basically, right? Like that experience. Well, that experience of it comes back to a conversation around spirituality, like being able to when you fast, pray, tahajjud, keep up to the 5 daily prayers, just remembering Allah every moment. If someone really tries to run towards or persevere with, trying to remember Allah in every little aspect. And also, Sheikh, you're talking about, the people that may have been doing mundane work in the past, like threading things and whatnot. Like it looks mundane and boring maybe to the average person in this day and age, right? But it's such beauty, right? Like such amazing spirituality that you can just attain by just doing something that's monotonous and all that. And so I play sports, I play cricket, and then I'm trying to find ways to incorporate that Islamic spirituality into those practices that otherwise people seem boring, right? And it's like but some people that only adhere to that reason, skepticism mindset is never going to experience that ever. Like, and it's unfortunate, right? It's like living the world on like 5%, like 10% living the world, right? And sorry, just to go back to what you're talking about, and Nadeem mentioned about this day and age and technology and all that. I was actually listening to a bit of Lex Fridman's podcast, like the interview he did with Elon Musk, Neuralink and the Future of Humanity. And I don't know, like I was listening to it and I'm like, all right, this is cool. This is interesting in the sense that, what Elon Musk is trying to do, like speed up the I think, brain signals and the sense of attaining more information, humans possibly in the future. Like right now we're talking at well, let's just say 1 speed, 1x, being able to communicate in 2x or 3x, right? And it's pretty interesting. You're listening. But then it just kind of hit me at one point, maybe like 30 minutes in, I'm like, what are they doing this for though, right? Like, I don't understand, like, what are the ends, right? Like, yeah, it's great. Obviously, he's talking about from a medical standpoint, it could help people, like, that's fine, right? But he's obviously talking it from a normal everyday standpoint, how this may shape our day to day. And I'm just like, how does this, like as a Muslim, right? Obviously, maybe you can debate, discuss things at a faster speed and learn more things and information, right? But how does that really help from what ultimately matters, our relationship with Allah and spirituality? It actually doesn't. I don't know, it probably crops it even more, if anything, which is kind of scary, right? It's like, so it makes me think, like, what is their ends, like, as a non-Muslim? Like, have they really, like as Muslims, we're every day we're pondering and reflecting, right? Every moment of our action and the reasons for our actions, our intentions, because our will be judged according to our intentions, and our actions will be judged accordingly. So I don't know what ends are they doing it for. They're maybe trying to think of. They might say, "Oh, I'm trying to help humanity," but I don't know if it's just enough. You know, what do you think?
Anytime you're not directed by revelation, it's for the nafs. Because it's your own it's your own independent decision, right? That is from the nafs. And even, I mean, you can make religion for the nafs too, but at least you have a direction to go in to continue to purify your intentions. So that's why in the sa'yakum nashatta, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, indeed, your labors, even mankind, is so diverse, different. Elon is doing this, and Bezos is doing this, and Bill Gates is doing this, and this religious guy is doing this, and this sports guy is doing this. There's so many things people are doing. Everyone's just trying to do what they think they need to do, want to do, should do. And in the end, the only one that's going to last is the one who does it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As you said, all of this will come to naught. Whatever you build, whatever you develop, you will go. One thing that's so clear is that anyone who creates anything in this world or develops anything is going to go in some amount of time, right? They're going to go in some amount of time. No matter how long you've lived now, just times that amount of lifespan by 2 or 3. But if you're listening to this, maximum 4 or 5, and you got to know that your time is limited. And so people are doing all these things, but leaving it here. Now, if they have a problem understanding that there's something beyond, then it makes this world essentially and utterly futile. Okay? And this is why what Islam is saying is do in this world. All those good things that people are doing, do in this world. But you're doing it for the next world. It's not just for here. So you have a promise. And even if that, just to live knowing that promise, you must end your life in a better way than someone who does not believe that at all. Or doesn't know at all. You just don't know what's going on. That's pretty scary, right? So alhamdulillah, we have that promise that we do good in the dunya, and we do, and it'll be good in the akhirah, alhamdulillah, no matter how it turns out.
Yeah, especially with having our relationship with Allah, and running towards that, and all our actions are shaped by what we see as ultimate end and what happens in the hereafter. That's super critical. And unfortunately, even atheists talk about they make this, like, a lot of Muslims might say, oh, there's nothing specifically in the Quran talking about atheism or those kind of arguments. But I'm like, wait, Allah, Allah says in the Quran about people that denied the hereafter, right? There's nothing going to be happening after, the famous story in Surah Al-Kahf with the 2 gardens as well. If there is something better, I'll get something better. And it's the arrogance, subhanAllah, right? But, it's all about essentially knowing that there's more to this, right? And knowing that actually, wait, Allah has addressed these kind of, these people, they use a label of atheism or agnosticism and all that, and make claims about the hereafter, right? But these have all happened throughout time, right? My teachers told me about cyclical time, Islamically, the nations that come, they build themselves up, civilizations happen, people prosper, people disobey Allah, and then that civilization gets destroyed, and it just keeps repeating and repeating over as time passes, right? So it's cyclical in nature. We see the same patterns, behaviors. People now and before have the same, sort of behaviors, right? It's nothing new. We're not some spiritual enlightened people now, right? There's people that are just like us before, right? And it's trying to be closer to Allah. But unfortunately, so when it comes to denying the hereafter, it's happened so many times where people have come and then Allah has, sort of shown no, this is what happens. Civilizations get destroyed if you don't follow his ways. So I'm just curious in regards to the Quran, and what aspects, as in the current day and age, should we reflect on, or what themes you think is really important that a lot of people, or maybe many Muslims, have lost touch, and that we should reconnect more? What themes do you think that, I've just talked about sort of the denial of the hereafter and that side of things, but is there anything through your also counseling work? I'm sure you come across I also wanted to ask you about like what are the main issues you have experienced or you feel is crucial in this day and age? Like what sort of issues are Muslims facing that they come to you with their troubles? And what's the
I
main
mean,
one?
we've touched on a lot. Sorry?
Like what would you say is the main one, and how would you use the Quranic themes to kind of explore those aspects as well in the current day?
We've touched on a few of them, and I think what it begins with is worldview. Worldview. So it's not so much a problem of belief as much as worldview that affects your belief. So right now, there was a time in which foreign powers tried to impose their views on Muslims, and they were able to sway a few, but by force they realized you can't change the aqidah of Muslims. What happened after mass migration? All of us are speaking in the West. Like we don't even know. We can't even speak for people in the East, even though the vast majority of Muslims are there. We are the ones having a dialogue in the West between us. So our challenge is not in something being forced on us, but something tempting us, being convinced slowly by it. Like, okay, stay, be Muslim here, have your mosques, have your whatever, freedom, wear whatever you want, obey the laws, but you will learn our ideas as they develop. And slowly, it's the ideas of their ideas of justice, freedom, equality, their ideas of, which have obviously merit in all of those things, but the implications that they come with, their idea of sexuality, their idea of family, or if there is an idea of family, their idea of autonomy, agency, their idea of power, their idea of many of these, their idea of morality, ethics, all of those things slowly start to creep in to the Muslim mind, but not through force, but by temptation, by reason. And that's one of the biggest things in our time now, that it's not about the necessary. We can talk about weed. We can talk about, pornography. We can talk about, relationships and all these types of things. But it's tied. All of that is tied to an ideology and a philosophy and an ethos that's coming into the Muslim Ummah. How do we stop that? When we can talk about that, then a lot of the minor issues or like the specific issues can help to become solved. And so I think that those are all the questions that we have is when you start changing your mind view, your worldview by a little bit. So you may have very practicing Muslim women, for example, but signed on to like a very Western liberal feminism that's kind of creeped into the Islam. That doesn't mean they're not Muslim at all. They could be very devout, and there could be men whose mind views have also been affected by the same thing, Western liberal feminism, that they're signing on to, or the other side, a kind of a red pill kind of masculinity, or a power politic that that tempts them into thinking that the Muslim world is weak and therefore they deserve what they're going through. And so there's so many different things calling Muslims, tempting them outside of what is actually safe and what is good for them and our community. And that, I think those are the things that we're going to have to take a deeper dive into, another time. But there are scholars on the higher levels and in the communities that are addressing these things. Yaqeen Institute is doing a very good job. Of course, Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah has talked about these types of things. There are many other scholars that have been, Shaykh Abdullah Evans talks about these types of things. There might be many others who speak about these issues. Dr. Yasir Qadi as well is another person. They're dealing with it from an ideas level and talking about it. There are others who are dealing with it from a level of let's make communities, let's do spirituality, let's actually reignite spirituality amongst Muslims. Others are doing it from a knowledge level. Let's write books, let's translate things, let's do classes. Whatever the effort is, some people could just say, let's do boys groups, girls groups, let's do sports, let's do singing, let's do whatever it is, qasid, nasheeds, whatever it is. The effort has to be now a pan-Islamic effort of whatever it takes to reconnect us back to our Quran and Sunnah and the tradition of our Muslim community. That's what's important. That connection is the most important thing. Losing that connection and having it infiltrated, that is the worst thing. Because when you have the mentality change, you either try to infect the main body and try to convince others, but when that gets pushed out, if we're firm, then it pushes those people out into the fringes. So there are Muslims who are starting from the middle, getting pushed out into the fringes, just by the fact that they've imbibed ideas that brings them out, right? It brings them out. So we have to not only keep our base strong, but try to help those people who are affected by and we're all actually probably affected in some ways by these ideas. So I don't know if that's very high level, like that's very top down, but those are what I would say. It's on the level of ideas, community, and connection.
In regards to, oh, sorry, do you want to say something, Nadeem?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so with just tying it back to counseling as well, and I mean, in the sense of you described, Sheikh, obviously that's important. That's why we need to put in the work, the hard yards. Much that's what you're doing as well within the community, and also responsible, so responsibility for Muslims to put in the hard yards, whether it be like content, putting the works out there, making it more accessible, doing lectures, talks, all that sort of stuff, inshallah. So also connecting that to, I know you've done also an interview with Dr. Shadil Masri, but also you also talk about OCD and Waswasa. So I also wanted to touch on that, and if it kind of interconnects or connects to what you've been mentioning about how we are affected, because perhaps the society that we're in, it's embroiled in sort of ideas, right? So we sort of don't have to. It's like it reminds me of the hadith of how Rasulullah said, like, the dust of riba will catch, Muslims even in the future, which will probably live in that time, right? So similarly, right, using that as like an analogy, it's like the all these ideas were experiencing the dust of it because, we live in a more interconnected, globalized society, right? And so maybe Waswasa OCD kind of fits into those discussions, right? So I'm just curious as to maybe to start off, like, what is OCD? How would you define OCD to be?
This is a whole podcast on its own. This is a whole podcast on its own.
How much time do you have, Sheikh? We can go for longer if you have time.
Not too much time, actually. So I think maybe I can come back because this is my kind of like, it's become a type of specialty, even though I didn't mean it to be. But if you don't mind, shall we loop back and do this properly? Because I can answer a few questions.
Okay, yeah, and then we'll do a whole podcast.
What would you like more? What would you like more? Because I have about
we'll get a little teaser.
I'm sorry.
We'll make a little teaser. We'll get a little teaser. We'll ask little questions, and then we'll expand, inshallah, in another episode.
Okay, so what I would say is obsessive compulsive disorder. It's a psychological disorder. We tie that into, we call it waswasa qahariya. It is whisperings, devilish whisperings that overcome one, and intrusive thoughts that make one obsess over certain worries and fears, and behave in a compulsive fashion to try to relieve that. Commonly, it's like people overdoing their wudu, thinking they committed kufr all the time, spending hours in the bathroom and showering, repeating their prayers, thinking that they divorced their wife when they didn't, being just afraid of everything. That's a religious level of OCD. That's called scrupulosity. It's something that I started getting into helping or treating when I realized, as a person who's answering questions online for about 10 years and teaching online, that most of my students were actually OCD sufferers. And when I realized that, a lot of the people who are religious today, there's an inordinate proportion of people pursuing religious knowledge that are actually psychologically disturbed. And they're ordinary people like you and me, but they've got at least according to the Western society, it would be called a psychological illness. In the Islamic society, you could call it a spiritual illness, but the two actually go hand in hand. They're the same thing, essentially. Whether you take the psychological, like Western science explanation, whether you take what's going on spiritually, it's the same concept, generally speaking. It's when those doubts and fears become a problem for you. Everybody has doubts and fears, but you're not supposed to pay attention to the mind. The mind chatters. And it's not, your thoughts are not you. When you start to take your thoughts too seriously, some people are very intelligent, and so they overthink and ruminate. And in a society and time where you have a lot of isolation, very little social interaction, not as many healthy things in a society to keep one, whether it's socialization, whether it's spiritual, whether it's physical health, no sleep. When you combine all these things, the mind becomes very weak. The spirit becomes very weak, and allows these wasawis, or these thoughts, to enter, and then they don't know what to do, because you live in the mind. So anything that comes in the mind, you think you're responsible for it. So you picture, a picture comes in your mind of a naked person. You say, astaghfirullah. Why do you have to say astaghfirullah? Your mind is not responsible. You start picturing an act of murder or violence. You say astaghfirullah. You picture blasphemy. And so what happens is they live in their mind so much, they think everything in their mind is real. And this is a delusion. And they start to do things. The second half is that in order to relieve themselves of this fear, there's no way they can control it, because your mind cannot be controlled necessarily. It's just a mishmash of all these things. So they begin to do superstitious rituals and actions, even calling it Islam, or they're suggested, hey, why don't you make wudu again? Why don't you just say the Shahada again? And so they use religion as a cover to do rituals and superstitions and make their own little mini religious practice within Islam, thinking that they're following the deen. And this comes out in full-blown OCD. This is when they come, their life, they're spending hours in the bathroom, for example. And it really takes people to the edge of their sanity sometimes, or the edge of their, their life being destroyed. And this is the work that we try to do, where I try to look at, not psychotherapy-wise, not medication, but religious teachings about waswasa, about OCD, and try to bring that to people in a step-by-step way to take them out of it through counseling. That's what I do.
It's great that you bring that up, Sheikh, because you mentioned the mind chatter. Because of technology around us, internet, social media, all that sort of stuff. If anything, we also have more chatter in our minds, and more things happening in our minds, or things that we overthink or think about, coupled with obviously people's experiences, the day-to-day, especially if they're stressed, all that sort of stuff, fear of the unknown, all that kind of thing. And I think a lot, like nowadays, like as a Muslim community, we definitely need to talk more about it, because people don't realize, like you mentioned, that, which is interesting, some of your students actually go through it, and you've noticed and picked up on that. That actually makes a lot of sense, because my background is more like temperament theory. So I've studied it for many years now. And that kind of meets well, because there's a very specific temper, like people that are very book smart, love to study and all that, mashallah, they become the scholars and all that. But some of them also lack like emotional intelligence, that side of things as well, because they're so book smart. But that's also connected to OCD in many ways, because like you're too much in your, like we mentioned, thoughts, doubting, doubts, pessimism, and consistently having these thoughts and consistently doubting yourself. And, it becomes an imbalance, which it kind of speaks to our also broader thing we talked about, masculinity and balancing ourselves, because we also have to realize those aspects of ourselves and our nafs and all that, and then balance ourselves and working towards. So I think it kind of fits nicely in all of that package. But why I talk about this is because when it comes to mind chatter, like I read like cricket books, and there's a famous one currently with circulating around the cricket world called "The Winning the Inner Battle" by Shane Watson. I don't know if you follow cricket, Sheikh. I know you.
I don't know anything about cricket. I probably played it once or twice. That's it.
Okay, no worries. So basically, Shane Watson, he's like one of the best all-rounder cricketers in this generation, and he's written a book, and he's made inroads because he actually goes into the psychology of how to do well from a mental standpoint in cricket. So he breaks it all down. He gets like studies from psychologists and all that sort of stuff, and brings it together. And the constant theme he's talked about in the book is about controlling the mind chatter, not letting the thoughts influence you in decision making, right? But it's so sad, because sometimes I read it as a Muslim and I'm like, man, like we as Muslims need to do like a Islamic version of this, because we bring so much with our spirituality into the picture. Like, because they have, like, for example, when you're batting, do you play baseball, Sheikh? Or are you familiar with baseball?
I grew up playing baseball. Baseball.
So we'll speak in baseball terms, right? It's probably more palatable for a wider audience. So like, because it's very similar to cricket with batting. You know how the baseballer lines up to hit the ball? So what we're taught in the cricket world is to don't think about the ball before the ball's bowled, so you conserve your mental energy, right? So people have thoughts and stuff, right? And the period where you're not looking to hit the ball, just think of something else, like clear your mind, because you want to hone in at the time and use your actual mental energy, because your mind can only control for a few seconds anyway, properly. So you want to conserve all that energy for that moment, and everything else, you'll have thoughts and chatter, but don't succumb to it. Rather, like try to think something outside of that actual sport, or try to be, staying away from, thinking about hitting the ball too much, or it stresses you out. And I'm just like, subhanAllah, like if someone wrote it from Islamic standpoint of like for me, what I do in cricket, like I try to do like, Orad or any sort of litanies, right? Before the ball is ball, like to take your mind away from the game, think about Allah. Say subhanAllah, alhamdulillah. Like these little things are like we do as a day-to-day as a Muslim. And it's like these, secular minded people kind of instill their own version of spirituality, but it's obviously devoid of that religious Islamic spirituality. It's like so missing. And like we as a community need to do that. So I wanted to ask you about like the importance of controlling that mind chatter, and to extent that it might be happening. And how do you build that awareness of knowing that, okay, wait, I'm actually worrying about something that I'm thinking about, that's just thoughts, but it's not actually me. It's just, it could be thoughts from shaitan, or just induced from life to life experiences, right?
Yeah, there's a saying that my sheikh told me that's very, very useful in this. And I say it to my clients, and that is, the mind is an excellent tool, an excellent servant, but a very poor master. The mind is an excellent servant, but a very poor master. You use your mind as a tool to do certain things. You access it when you need it, but you don't make it the leader of your entire existence. Once it becomes your master, that's when you're going to be tortured. The seat of a person is not in their mind. The seat of a person is in their heart, their soul. But that's a place where if you're not used to going down to, you're not going to know how to access that if you're just stuck in your head all day long. And living in a time of the age of information, the age of education, the age of isolation, people are just stuck in their minds all the time. People who play sports, they don't get these problems. They're not. My clients are not sports people. They're computer programmers. They're doctors. They are engineers. Almost never people in the humanities. Almost never people who are in the trades. Mostly people who use their brains and they think in black and white. In the STEM fields, often they think in black and white, and housewives who are educated, but then all of a sudden home just doing nothing. They get OCD pretty bad sometimes. And people who have suddenly grown up in a knowledge culture and then suddenly become religious and want to learn a lot of details about Islam. So the entire thing about the mind connection here is that you're not supposed to be living through your mind all the time. You're supposed to be living in real life, as you said. You're playing the sport. You're not thinking about playing the sport. You get what I'm saying? You use your mind at a certain time to focus, but then the rest of it is all reflex. The people of OCD are living their life thinking about what they're doing all the time. Can you imagine how tiring that would become? Everything you're thinking about, everything you're doing, you're thinking about it and analyzing it. That wears them out, so they can no longer function properly in life anymore. Right. So, I mean, great. If OCD people could go out and get some exercise, that would be the best thing. Right. Go out and, eat something. Go out and make love. Go out and now dhikr and spirituality is good, but only to the extent that you're taught to bypass the mind and go to the heart. If not, then even your spirituality and dhikr can become part of your OCD practice. Isn't that strange? Even your religion can. So the depth and the meaning has to be there to cut through the layers of the mind and all the layers of the mind and the chatter and hit the heart. That's when the spirituality benefits you. And to be honest, I don't think I would have gotten into this work if I did not understand it through that lens. If I did not understand it through that lens of cutting through the mind to get to the heart. However, my treatment or my counseling does not always take that approach, because people don't always have the time or the experience or the willingness to go through that. But rather, I come through an aqidah approach, which is a more detailed answer. But in the end, it challenges one thing. How do you perceive Allah? And how do you perceive what's happening in the world? When you understand who the creator and the controller of all things really is, your wasawis can go away. But if you are stuck in the dunya and thinking about it through the dunya, then that's where OCD comes in. It's people who have overly relied on the world as a means, and they made it their everything. The way to get out of this is through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why we have an advantage over non-Muslim or atheist OCD sufferers. They just try to reduce their OCD. We can solve it completely, at least the compulsions, 100%, by focusing on Allah.
So would you say that like remembering Allah and dhikr can supersede and raise, because sometimes our mind and our thoughts, because it can be linked to our desires, make us go down and make us sink into this sort of pit of just worry and stress and all that sort of stuff. And it sort of and we end up relishing in that sort of environment. Whereas I feel like when we're remembering Allah, His attributes, all this sort of stuff, and Allah and and being grateful for Allah, it sort of raises us from that level of worry and concern, and trusting Him. Tawakkul.
Yeah, you're going to be surprised at my answer. And no, I don't think it really helps I don't think so. There are a lot of people who are involved in tasawwuf and even scholars who have OCD. So actually, it's not even that level. It's strange, isn't it? You would expect me to say, yes, dhikr is the solution. It's going to do everything. But no, the people who are involved in a lot of dhikr are the ones in the biggest OCDs. What do you do about that? Scholars who don't say anything to anybody, they're big scholars who have OCD. So it's a psychological illness where dhikr and all that can help, but it's only when it's on a deep dhikr. What do I mean by deep dhikr? It cuts through and ignores the chattering of the mind and the threats of the mind to connect to Allah. So whether you're from any group, whether you do dhikr or you don't do dhikr at all, it's actually not, dhikr does help. It brings calmness to the heart, there's no doubt. But if your OCD becomes in your dhikr, then what do you do? Then what do you do? If your practice becomes that, you have to go to Allah. So no matter what, even your dhikr cannot become a veil from Allah. Even your prayer, even everything, nothing can become a veil from Allah because it takes you. So you have to go into the very ground of your being itself and connect to the reality of what the world is. That's why there's that advantage. I think it goes back to Tawheed, if you ask me. It's Tawheed, it's Aqidah. And the deepest spirituality is before you say anything. It's what's going on inside here. What's going on in your mind.
So with the OCD people, sorry, just to hone in, that do those actions in dhikr, but if anything, it's facilitating the OCD, right? Is it from the perspective that they are seeing it from a ritualistic point of view, like a very physical-based action, and they're monotonous in that behavior and actions? But I think there's a differentiation between dhikr from a very physical, just doing it off your tongue, versus actually like deep contemplation, deep introspection, deep connection with Allah as well.
So there's two sides of it, right? It's the ritual is the solution, is like how is the other end that they use to try to solve the problem, not realizing they're getting worse into the problem. It's the superstitious belief. It's making religion a superstition and thinking thoughts about Allah about a way that He is that's not true. And this is the strangest thing, why even scholars can get it. But for example, you begin to worship fiqh, you begin to worship Islam, and you don't worship Allah. What's that supposed to mean? What it means is the rules of fiqh become so rigid to you in your mind that you feel like even Allah can't save you from them. When the validity of an action gets confused with the acceptance of that action from Allah, the validity is a worldly ruling. Scholars can tell you what's valid. They can't tell you what's accepted. Only Allah can tell you that. When you begin, that's what I'm saying, that the outward of religion, the surface of religion, gets people into OCD. The scholars themselves, I'm sorry to say this, many of them cause people OCD, or they push it. And this is the funny thing. People, I know it sounds funny to say. When I say this to religious people, they get a little shocked. I realize that we, as people answering questions, are causing people OCD. We are responsible for it. Why? Because the depth of the religion that we're teaching is not deep enough. It's not the true depth of Islam. It's very superficial, that is caused by what? The breakdown of our societies and our knowledge tradition, which has only let us access a certain level of religion that's outward. And as you said, the deep dhikr, the deep penetration of values, that is the most important thing you can do. That should come before all of the other fardain, to be honest. That should come before all the other details. Now, all of the deen will come, but it has to come in the proper order. These days, we're trying to front end the information and details, because a person studied to university, so they want the details. But they're not working here. They're not understanding life and the world. That should have been the basic thing. But we did it. We got a flip side because we're in the age of information. That's the biggest problem with OCD in our time, in my opinion.
It's amazing you bring that up, Sheikh, because there's so much like going off OCD, like what you mentioned about scholars having OCD. Wouldn't you say it's harmful that, like what you mentioned about defending very specific, religious stances or positions, like I've always found like, and it makes me disillusioned with a lot of people within the community that are leaders. Like they will defend, like they're very dogmatic in their approach, you know, and defend that position at all costs, right? And it might have a detrimental effect to someone that sees that sort of way of thinking. That even like makes them disillusioned with Islam. So I don't know if Nidhi, you had a question, but I also wanted to ask. Do you think that's a big problem in the community as well? Like with the way that an OCD scholar is presenting Islam, it's like very skewed naturally,
Oh,
right?
this is the biggest problem. I tell people now, I answered questions for more than 10 years on websites, right? And I still do answer questions on Instagram. I honestly tell people who have this type of mindset, first thing you have to do is unplug from the fatwas, the Q&A, the clips of people answering questions. I know it sounds like what, but that's my fiqh, that's my deen. It's like, yeah, but there's something so much more basic that you have not understood, that anything you put, if you put a train without proper tracks and run it on the ground, it will crash. It won't go anywhere. And if you put those tracks in the wrong direction, no matter how many times you send a train straight, it's going to go astray. That's the problem with information, with a mind that's not ready to understand it. And that's what's happening in our time. We're giving people very, very heavy information, and they're definitely not ready, aqidah-wise, spirituality-wise, messing people up big time. And that's why I had to raise the alarm. I haven't gone public with this very much, but I have to start saying, guys, we're actually, a lot of our movements are actually, messing people up in a big way. Now you can say, it's not our fault. We have to teach deen. Fine, you do. But why don't you do it in a way that's OCD safe, friendly? You're not following prophetic teachings on this. And this is a funny thing, that it's kind of understanding that the tradition will always have to be updated to the needs of its time. It's not going to change the tradition, but bringing it back to the prophetic example. I'll give you an example, right? Because you might be wondering, what's this guy on about? How did the Prophet ﷺ teach people how to pray? Nadeem, what do you think? How did he teach people how to pray?
I would say by example.
Did he start with the fard, wajib, sunnah? Did he draw something on the board? What did he do?
Honestly, I'm lost for an answer. I would say by example, by showing, by praying, and then getting them to kind of emulate his behavior.
That's it. 100%. He said, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." Pray the way you see me pray. Now, if you had to just watch somebody and imitate them, would there be a little variation in what you did and what they did?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, yeah,
absolutely. And if they're not specifically telling you certain things, would you interpret their changes as possibly a different position? Or if you saw only one of the ways that they were doing it, would you not think that is the right way? And if you didn't see it, that you don't think the other way is the right way, you would. Which is why we have so many fiqh differences. They couldn't even decide, where did the Prophet put his hands in prayer. Imagine that. They couldn't decide whether he said Ameen out loud or not. They couldn't decide where his eyes have to go. So, but what does it mean? It's not to say, the Sharia is saying Sharia doesn't know. No, you're not understanding that the Prophet ﷺ taught in an organic way how to live a life of religion. When people came, he did not categorize everything. That was a later construct, a later thing that was necessary to preserve the religion. And it worked for a long time, and it still works today, and we still teach it. But what happens is that organicness of how people who have OCD are not the ones who've been religious from, raised in Yemen and living their whole life. And they're not the people with OCD. It's the people who grew up in a secular Western system mostly, and then they became religious through the internet, and all of a sudden they got all this information, but their hearts were not ready to take it. And the scholars who were teaching them, they just thought, if I give the information that I have, that's deen. They're not ready for that. And that's the problem that they're falling into. They have to go back. Wait. The Prophet ﷺ at one point forbade his followers, Sahaba, to ask him questions. You cannot ask me a question. He said, leave me alone as long as I have not told you what to do. If I've not told you about something, leave me alone. Don't ask me. These days, every single question you can ask and get a fatwa. Every single question. And so that has really, really overloaded the minds of people. And they're hearing, they're not understanding that some of these ideas in fiqh are actually subjective. So one strict sheikh tells them, must be like this. And they're like, oh my gosh. And there's some cultures and some movements, I'm going to be very honest, that have more OCD than others. You're not going to be happy when I say which. But I noticed that there are some madhabs, some movements, some regions that just that put more OCD in the way that they teach religion. You have to back off. You don't see that type of OCD coming out of, very organic cultures that have a good balance of fiqh and spirituality and aqidah and adab and art and cuisine and family life. You don't see that in those balanced people. That's why it's a problem among our time, especially the westernized young people. We have to fight against the how by making the balance.
Yeah, it seems like it makes so much sense what you say about Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the way he taught, and how the ashab even memorized the Quran, bits at a time, and understood it, completely internalized it, and then somehow enacted it. But I guess also, and I don't want to open the can of worms again, probably another podcast, but it seems like this probably has a pretty large implication for raising children. If you're very, very strict and punitive.
100%. I just had a lot of people get OCD, religious OCD, by a parent who was like, you're going to go to hell if you do this, you're going to go to Jahannam if you do this, focusing on scary things. I just told one parent, like, stop talking to your kid about death. Like, okay, they're 5, they're 6, it's enough. I told another parent today, their kid has OCD. They're like, why? We're not even we didn't push religion on them. Yeah, but you smothered them so much. They're smothered, you did no freedom, no idea of going out and doing things on their own. That just made them into a very scared little individual. One little religious warning from the internet and they got scared. So develop their mind, make them open, make them loved. Childhood trauma, huge determinant of OCD when you grow older. Why does a 30-year-old get OCD? And it's a recurrence of some type of childhood trauma. That's, so a lot of people with childhood OCD have childhood trauma. It could be abuse or not. It could be bullying. It could be just a smothering parent. It could be an illness. It could be anything. So it's a psychological disorder, and the holistic aspect of our deen is really what will solve a lot of these issues, inshallah. Along with treatment, of course. You need treatment. Sometimes you need medication, right? It's hard to admit for people, but sometimes people have a chemical imbalance. What can you do? So the treatment of OCD, alhamdulillah, I think it's I'm really glad that we're now getting the word out there, alhamdulillah.
I'm so glad we're also talking about this, Sheikh, because I think we don't realize, unfortunately, it's not a common talking point where our psychological frame of mind actually influences the way we see Islam. And then some people can be very charismatic with the way they speak, and they obviously make inroads within the community from, they have a platform, right? And so, it's really important. And I think there's so much to talk about on that lens. I don't know if would OCD connect to narcissism as well? That's another separate thing. So,
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't deal with psychology. People think because I counsel for OCD that I know about psychology. I'm not interested, and I'm not involved in that at all, to be very honest with you. So people come for many things. Why? I'm just looking at one little thing from a spiritual, religious lens, and I'm really interested in other things, but I'm not an expert on it. But I have to take your leave now. So, alhamdulillah.
Okay. Okay. Appreciate Jazakallah khair for coming on the show, Sheikh. I do have one question, but if you need to go right now, then it's all good.
I do have to go. Inshallah, we'll do it next time. Inshallah.
Okay. Appreciate your time, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. But thank you to the listeners for tuning in. And if you want to, support the podcast, check us on our social medias. I'll put the Sheikh's links on our show notes, inshallah. So from our special guests, Sheikh and Nadeem, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing you off. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you.